Okay, let's talk about the reinforcing effects of drugs. What is common to all drugs of abuse? Okay, so one of the things that you should recognize right off the bat is that there's not going to be one effect that's going to be common to all drugs of abuse, because of course you know that we have different classes of drugs. Some that are stimulants, some that are depressants, some that are hallucinogens, etc. So the one thing that all drugs of abuse have in common is that they all activate the limbic system. Okay, so how do they activate this system? Remember that I said for our purposes, a lot of what we talk about is oversimplified. But if we can simplify how they activate this system, we know that they will do so by either directly or indirectly activating the nucleus accumbens. Okay? So if you remember from previous slides when we had that picture of the limbic system and how it interacts with other brain regions, you'll notice that you have the nucleus accumbens receiving input from the ventral tegmental area. So the ventral tegmental area is one of the ways that you have indirect activation of the nucleus accumbens, but also you get input from other brain regions as well. Okay, so all drugs of abuse activate the limbic system, and they do so by either directly or indirectly activating the nucleus accumbens. Okay, so let's talk a little about drug and natural reinforcers. What do they have in common? Okay, hopefully you see a theme here. Both drugs and natural reinforcers activate the limbic system. So those things that we get natural quote-unquote pleasure from, or those natural reinforcers, the things that we do over and over again, encounter over and over again, those also activate the limbic system. So drugs and natural reinforcers activate the limbic system. So obviously there's an important way that they differ. Okay? Natural reinforcers have what we call a satiation mechanism, okay, or feedback mechanisms that tells the body, okay, that's enough. So if we consider things like food and water, there are feedback mechanisms that tell us, okay, you're no longer thirsty or you're no longer hungry. Now, we, and myself in particular, don't always listen to those signals. But if I ate at a slow pace and gave my body time enough to receive the appropriate feedback, then I wouldn't go back for a second serving, because my body would tell me, you're no longer hungry, you've satisfied the nutritional needs, no need to eat anymore. Okay, so natural reinforcers have a satiation mechanisms that tell us when to stop, when there's enough, when the imbalance has been corrected. Okay, drugs of abuse do not have a mechanism like this. Now, it's important here that you not mistake things like vomiting and so forth with a satiation mechanism. That's your body recognizing a foreign substance, trying to get rid of it. That's not your body saying that you've had enough. Okay? And so when we talk about satiation mechanisms or having enough, we use terms like satiety or satiated. Satiety, the state of being satisfied, having enough. Satiation, satiated. All those things mean enough. Okay? Here we're going to talk about some things that influence or can affect the self-administration of drugs. Okay? First, we want to talk about what can happen to the reinforcing ability of a drug when the drug dose is high. Okay? So if an individual is taking a very large dose of a drug, what happens to that drug's reinforcing ability? Okay? So this may be the opposite of what you think. Actually, as the dose increases, the reinforcing ability of the drug actually decreases. So let's consider something like alcohol, for example. Once you get up to a really, really high dose, you may pass out, okay? And in that case, the drug no longer has reinforcing abilities. So many times for many drugs, you are often getting into danger zone once the dose gets too high. So it's not too reinforcing if I'm passed out. Okay, so think about things like that. And then very often when you get into really high doses of drugs, you're actually often getting into the aversive, more of the aversive effects and properties of the drug. Okay, so let's talk about some things that can affect the abuse potential for drugs that are self-administered. Okay, here we want to think about or recall the fact that all drugs of abuse activate the limbic system. Okay, and so here we want to consider when the limbic system is, when it's out of balance, when the animal is thirsty, hungry. But we also want to include here stress, okay, because stress also creates a situation where there's an imbalance in the limbic system, okay? So anytime that there's an imbalance in the limbic system, organisms may be more likely to self-administer a drug, which would increase the abuse potential for a drug, because when the limbic system is out of balance, then the organism's motivation is altered, and so some things could be perceived as being more reinforcing. So for example, in laboratory settings, when we talk about those operant experiments from chapter 2, where the animals press a lever, if you have an animal that is well fed, has had enough to drink, okay, they're not very motivated to even explore enough to press that lever. And so you reduce the animal's body weight by food restricting them. Now, you're still feeding them, you're just cutting back a little bit. You're giving them fewer calories than they're used to consuming. That alters the motivational state, and you're more likely to press a lever. So here we've got things like stress, thirst, hunger, that can affect the abuse potential for drugs that are self-administered. We also want to consider here task demands. What's required to get the drug, okay? Even if the drug has a good reinforcing ability, if what's required to get it is so unreasonable, the organism may simply stop responding. And so we will also want to consider that term that we used earlier in chapter 2, the breaking point, when the task demands become so high that the organism stops responding. So again, here we're talking about things like thirst, hunger, stress, task demands. And then related to the task demands, we want to make sure that we consider the breaking point as well. Okay? Some additional things that can affect self-administration of a drug. Prior exposure. Has the organism had the drug before? Okay? And if it's a case where the organism has had the drug before, are they currently in a state of withdrawal where the organism is experiencing withdrawal symptoms? Okay? And so experiencing withdrawal symptoms, is certainly a motivation for self-administering a drug, because self-administration of the drug would halt the withdrawal symptoms. And then we have something called priming. Okay, when I explain the concept of priming, I ask people to think of painting. If you've ever painted, very often we put primers on the wall before we actually paint the wall with the color that we want to paint it with. And if you think about what those primers are doing, those primers are getting the wall ready to accept the color of paint that you're about to put on it. It's setting up the conditions for it to be painted the best way, and for that color that you want it to be as vibrant as possible by putting down that primer. And you'll see nowadays that a lot of paints have primers in it. But I digress. Okay, so really when we talk about priming in terms of drug use, this is really setting up an organism to use a drug. So there are really no task demands associated with priming. Here I'm going to give you something. Here, I'm the new drug dealer on your block. Here, have a little bit of this. They're just going to give a small sample, and when you want something, come see me. They're priming them, giving them something for free, setting them up so that you come back later. One of the easiest ways to probably understand this concept is if you've ever been in a food court at a mall, okay? And oftentimes, probably every mall that I've probably ever been to has had someone with a tray of bourbon chicken with a little toothpick sticking out of it. That's an example of priming. They give you a free sample of that bourbon chicken, hoping that they're getting you or setting you up to come over to their kiosk or their stand to buy chicken from their company. Okay, so the idea with priming is if you give the organism the drug, some prior exposure, okay, where there are little or no task demands associated with that. Okay, the idea is that later on, when they're given a choice, because of this prior exposure, that perhaps they're more likely to choose the drug over a non-drug reinforcer later. Okay, now some of the research actually says that it's probably still a 50-50 chance here, but researchers are still examining the effects of priming on drug self-administration. Okay, and then place conditioning. Okay, I think we talked about condition place preference in one of the other chapters. With place conditioning, it's the place where you take a drug. That place becomes conditioned to the effects of the drug. So, of course, if I experience something pleasant in the place that I always take the drug, that when I'm in that place, I'm more likely to self-administer the drug. Okay, so that's just another way that we're talking about conditioning, and the effects of a drug become conditioning to a place, the physical location that the individual is taking the drug. Okay, and these two terms we are readdressing here. We may not have actually introduced condition sensitization, but it should have been self-explanatory based on our discussion of condition tolerance and so forth. Remember condition tolerance. Okay, tolerance. In condition tolerance, we talked about the tolerance that develops to an effect of the drug becomes associated with a particular location. Okay, so that when the individual is, if the individual takes that drug in a new location, they could have a sudden loss of tolerance. Okay, and then with condition sensitization, remember sensitization is reverse tolerance. So you could have increased effects of a drug that are associated with a particular location. Okay, and so in these locations, the individual's propensity to self-administer the drug can be altered. Okay, and this is just to remind you that whenever we talk about conditioning, any stimulus can become associated with the effects of the drug. It could be the sight of the drug, it could be the smell of the drug, it could be any of the drug paraphernalia that are associated with using the drug, a needle, a spoon, a rubber tube that's used to tie around the arm. It could be money or the smell of money. Any stimulus can become conditioned with the effects of the drug. Okay, so let's introduce another concept here that kind of helps us explain why those stimuli, why once the stimuli that have become conditioned to the effects of the drug become increasingly important to the organism. Okay, so when we talk about incentive salience, when we talk about salience, or something, sometimes you may hear someone ask, what are the salient features of X, Y, or Z? What are the features that stand out that are more noticeable? Okay, and so there are certain things about drug paraphernalia or the stimuli that are particularly noticeable through one sensory system or another to the organism. So here we're going to talk about the characteristics of incentive salience. The first is that the stimulus is easily noticed by the organism. Okay, so it's something that easily catches the attention of the organism. The stimulus is easily noticed by the organism. The second characteristic is that the stimulus activates a behavior. Okay, so the cogs start turning, the wheels start turning. Okay, the stimulus is easily noticed by the organism, and that stimulus activates the behavior. The third thing is that the behavior that's activated is directed toward the stimulus. Okay, so it's not a random behavior that's activated, but it's a behavior that is directly related to that stimulus. Okay, so the stimulus easily attracts the attention of the organism. That stimulus activates a behavior. and that the behavior that's activated is directed toward the stimulus. So you'll probably see in your textbook that they also talk about incentive sensitization, and that's just talking about how some of these stimuli become increasingly important if the organism encounters them over and over again. Now, these terms are very closely related, and so I don't separate the two really, because it'd be really hard to talk about one without the other. Okay? So one of the last things we're going to talk about in this chapter is something called behavioral economics. And so this is applying the principles of economics to understand what happens to the the use of a drug once the demand goes up. What happens to the price of a drug? I am all tongue-tied. What happens to demand, okay, and the use of a drug when the price goes up? Okay, so if you've ever seen A Beautiful Mind, the study about, or the movie about the schizophrenic John Nash, some of John Nash's theories and mathematical work were very important to establishing this field that they call behavioral economics. And so recently they've applied these principles to help us understand what happens to demand when the price of a drug actually goes up. Okay, and so first we're going to talk about inelastic demand. Okay, now if you talk about something inelastic, we're talking about something that does not change. Okay, and so when we talk about demand and the price of the drug, when you think about what changes or what doesn't change is here, inelastic, we're saying the amount of money that the individual spends does not go up. So with inelastic demand, the individual spends the same amount of money, they just get less drug. Okay? With inelastic demand, the individual spends the same amount of money that they've been spending, but they just get less drug. Okay? One of the examples that I've been able to use over the last 14 years has been the price of gas. Let's say that you're on a fixed budget and you've only got $20 a week to spend, $20 a week in your budget that's dedicated to gas. Okay? So in this case, when you think about the price of gas, and right now it's starting to rise again, that I've still only got $20 a week to buy gas. Okay? That means that with that $20, I'm going to be getting less gas. Okay? So you're spending the same amount of money, you just get less gas. Also, if you look at the sizes of some of the containers in the grocery store, where it may no longer, ice cream may no longer be a full or true half gallon. If you look at the sizes of bags of potato chips, things like that, those things have decreased. So you're spending the same amount of money, you're just getting less product. That's inelastic demand. So the individual would spend the same amount of money, they would just get less drug. Okay? Now, with elastic demand, there are a couple of scenarios that are possible here. Okay? The individual could increase their spending to keep up with the increase in the price of the drug. Okay? The individual could increase their spending to keep up with the increase in the price of the drug. So let's say I lived in Collierville, or someplace that's distant from the University of Memphis. If I just spent $20 a week, I probably wouldn't have enough gas to make that commute. So I'm going to have to increase my spending to keep up with the increased cost of gas. Okay? So as the price of the drug goes up, the individual spends more money to keep up with the increased cost. Okay? The second thing that can happen with elastic demand is that the individual could decrease their spending in response to the increased price of the drug. Okay? So if we go back to that gas example again, this is a case where maybe now I'm going to find someone else who lives near me and I'm going to carpool. So in this way, I'm spending less money because you're driving Monday, Wednesday, Friday, I'm driving Tuesday, Thursday. Okay? Or some variation of that. Okay? But the individual may decrease their spending in response to the price increase. Okay? And then the third thing that could happen with elastic demand is that the individual could stop spending entirely in response to the price increase. Okay? They could say, well, it's just not worth it. Let's say the price of cigarettes, it's just not worth it, I'm going to quit smoking. Okay? They could stop spending in response to the the price increase. Or if we go back to the gas example, I had a student in one of my courses when we were talking about this very topic who actually stopped driving to campus. She started biking to campus. So she was not going to spend any money on gas. So she just biked to campus. Okay? That's elastic. So again, with inelastic demand, as the price of the drug goes up, individual spends the same amount of money, you just get less drug. With elastic demand, several things can happen. The individual could increase their spending to keep up with the increased cost of the drug. They could decrease their spending in response to the price increase, or they could stop spending entirely.